Hello and welcome to the Warframe tier list. Today we'll be going over Nidus. First things first, let's go into the build. So for Nidus, I tried a bunch of different builds, but the three that I found to perform the best were Gloom, Roar, and Pillage. I tried Fire Blasts with the augment to keep myself healed, but I found it to be too annoying to constantly have to spam it for healing. And I tried Terrify. The problem with Terrify is I did not have enough range to make the ability feel nice to use, which is why I eventually settled on Pillage. Thorough Strike would also work, as it also has a heal attached to it at base, so it would be nice. The problem with that is it is a conal armor strip, and I prefer the radial of Pillage. That being said, I will go to Gloom first. So Gloom was the easiest build. It is super simple. You just want a bit of strength, a bit of range, but not too much, base efficiency, and some duration. Rage is keeping our energy topped off without flow, and this just works. It's super simple. That's it. It's just super simple. As for the second build, it's Roar, opting for super high strength. We do not need a source of sustain on this build, as all of our abilities are free, except for Roar and Virulence. But Roar you only have to cast once every 47 seconds, and Virulence is free to cast. It actually gives you energy back, as long as you're casting it properly. And then, of course, Pillage is pretty much identical to Roar. However, you need a source of sustain, so I got rid of Continuity and slotted Rage. You could also slot Flow here instead, and this would also work. As for the Arcanes, we are using Avenger, as it is just free on Nidus, and Molt Augmented. Alternatively, you could get rid of Avenger for Guardian or Grace for a source of healing or more damage mitigation. Grace would be a heal every time. Guardian would just be free armor for damage mitigation. Both would work completely fine. Now, you may have noticed that I dropped his 2 instead of his 4. The reason for this was because I still needed a source of healing, so I needed to keep his 4. So I opted to drop his 2. The reason for this is because I do not believe that his 2 is that good, because, like I mentioned earlier already, you don't really run that much range on Nidus, other than the initial 45% for Parasitic Link and Gloom. Running more than that is completely redundant, as it does nothing for any of his other abilities, and even then, this ability is mediocre. Why? This ability is not allowed to be recast until 2 conditions are met. Either A, you kill all enemies that were affected by it, or B, the duration runs out. What ends up happening is enemies get sucked through walls and ceilings, and they get stuck on the other side. And then you won't kill them, so then you end up having to wait the entire duration. This means that you can only cast this ability every 7 to 11 seconds based on your duration, making it not that good. You can of course run negative duration, but then it ruins the rest of your kit. You could also run the augment to allow you to recast it. However, I found in practice for this to be pretty mediocre. Now, as for the rest of the kit, the primary is your AoE weapon of choice. I used the Archoplasmor in the first run using a Heat Inherit build. This worked completely fine. I ended up getting just as high KPM with this as the Brahma. As for the Brahma, which was the second weapon I used, I believe the Brahma to be very good with Nidus because of Avenger and Teeming Virulence, giving you a bunch of primary critical chance, leading you to, if you had a proper Brahma, mine is magnetic, so I could not do this, to drop this infected clip right here for Prime Firestorm for an even larger AoE. The reason that you could do this is because you have so many buffs that you'll just kill the enemies anyway, and now you just do it in a larger radius. I literally have a magnetic Brahma, and it's only 30% weighted, and I do not have Prime Bane of Corrupted, and I was still one-shotting everything easily, so you would very easily be able to slot this in here for more blast radius. As for your secondary, you of course want to use the Nucor, as you do not need Augur mods because you do not have a shield, and you're running Arcane Avenger unless you opt for something else, so you can run a full DPS crit Nucor, and this thing just shreds. And then now we're onto the melee weapon. The melee weapon is your melee weapon of choice. However, I suggest the Praetos for the sprint, speed, and the parkour velocity. As for the focus school, you have multiple options. If you're using Pillage and you do not have Nidus Aura mode to use Corrosive Projection, you need to use Moderai for the 40% ability strength to reach the 400% threshold to full strip with Pillage in one cast. If you have him Aura mode, you can slot Corrosive Projection, you do not need Moderai. If you do not need Moderai, I suggest either Unero, that way you have another armor strip for the Pillage or Gloom build, or for the Prime Sure-Footed, whenever your Parasitic Link times out or the target dies, and the 200 armor. Alternatively, there is Vazarin for Protective Sling for more iframes. All of these focus schools work on Nidus. This leads us to the final part of the build, which of course is the Panzer, which is just a standard Panzer build with the synth mods. You do not actually need the synth mods here, as we are not running Equilibrium, and even if we were, you do not have a shield, so you would always be able to pick up the health orbs. However, I still slotted them for the passive holster reload. Whenever I was using the Archoplasmor, what I would do is I would use my primary until I ran out of ammo, and when I ran out of ammo, I would just simply switch to my nuclear, and when that ran out of ammo, switch back to the primary. This meant that I had absolutely zero downtime and could just constantly kill enemies to maintain my high KPM. Alright, now moving on to the rankings, we'll be discussing Nidus in relation to 4 separate topics. Firstly, his KPM, secondly, his survivability, thirdly, his viability, and finally, how fun he is to play. All of this data is sampled from a 90-minute solo Steel Path bot run with no specters and no on-call. I did a longer mission with Nidus so I could more accurately gauge his survivability. Please note that Nidus is a frame whose power significantly shifts depending on whether you're solo, playing with random people, or if you're in a pre-made group. In a pre-made group, he performs the best, obviously. In solo, he's okay, and with random people, he is pretty bad. For Nidus, I will toss him a bone, and I will rank him assuming that you're in a pre-made group with a Wisp. Alright, now moving on to his first topic, his KPM. Put simply, Nidus is a gun frame with a lot of buffs, allowing him to use weapons that don't typically get to see the light of day, such as the Archoplasmor and Endurance missions, or it makes weapons that are already very good even better, such as the Brahma. All of this leads to a pretty high KPM for just a gun frame, so I will give his KPM an A+. Now, moving on to his survivability, this is the first area where it significantly shifts based on if you're solo or with a team. By yourself, he is still extremely tanky. He can survive up until 90 minutes without really ever dying by himself, but then after that you kind of start spam dying, so you have to constantly build up your stacks, and your Link starts prematurely dying, which gets annoying. But with a Wisp, and assuming that you have a max ranked Umbral Fiber, which the reason I didn't do that is because it requires you to Umbra form him, he would be able to survive for, I would argue, up to 3 hours extremely easily. You would have like 6 to 7k health, pretty much a Naros, but you would actually have a 90% DR, assuming that you remain linked with an enemy rather than the Wisp. So, by himself, I would say that he has S- survivability or A+, but in a group, he easily gets a flat S. Now, moving on to the third topic, his viability, and this is the most significantly changed from being by yourself or playing with a group. Playing by yourself, he is extremely mediocre for his viability. Why? Well, in normal missions, such as like exterminates or captures, you don't really get to utilize his kit at all, because you start with 0 stacks, so you won't have the stacks built up to use your abilities to their fullest. And your Link, if you're using it for the damage reduction to stay alive, you can't really do that in an exterminate or a capture where you're just running through the mission as fast as possible. And then I guess you can link an ally, but even then, like, that's not necessarily needed, but it does help. So in solo play, like, he's really not that great other than in survival. The problem with disruption is it's also something that you have to move around too much in, so you wouldn't really be able to get to utilize his kit. But in survival, you can utilize his campy playstyle, same as defense. In exterminates or stuff like that, if you're in a premade, you can, in fact, link the person that's nuking, though this doesn't really matter unless you're doing Steel Path Relics. And Steel Path Relics, if he linked to a Mirage using the 4 nuke or a Volt or I don't know who else can nuke exterminates, to be honest, in Steel Path. But if he linked a Mirage or the Volt that's running through and nuking a Steel Path Relic, like an exterminate, it would make the mission go significantly quicker. But outside of that, in normal missions, he's pretty bad. The only place he truly excels is by doing a defense or a survival in a pre-made group planning to go for 3+ hours. At that point, if you have a Wisp, you have a permanent Wisp buff that has twice as much strength as she typically would, and this also boosts everybody in the group's survivability. Even if they're running a shield gate build, a Wisp having a 7k moat that just gives everybody 7k health allows somebody to survive even if they make a mistake, even at level cap. If you have 7k health, if you get hit by chip damage at level cap, you do have a chance to survive, albeit a small one, but if it's just something like a Lancer that shoots you, you do have a chance to survive. So in a pre-made group, I will give his viability an A. You may think that that's low, but the reason that I don't think it's higher is because Nidus's parasitic link buff on the Wisp, or anybody else for that matter, can be easily supplemented by just them summoning a specter. Which, yes, that sounds funny, but it is the truth. If you really care about getting the strength buff from parasitic link, you can just simply summon a specter. Yes, a real Nidus will provide a stronger buff, but is it really that big of a deal having a slightly worse parasitic link? Not really, especially when you have to consider the fact that you could then bring an entire different Warframe that can bring something else to the table and still get some of Nidus's effect from a specter. So I think the fact that an entire Warframe can just be replaced by a specter means that in no world do they ever deserve higher than like a flat A for viability, and even then I think it's being generous. Now, of course, moving on to the final topic, how fun is he to play? So, put simply, for a super campy gun frame, I think Nidus is actually pretty fun. He, of course, does have some annoyances, such as having to be linked to an enemy at all times for the 90% damage reduction, or just instantaneously dying, and having to micromanage your parasitic link. You pretty much have to be staring at it the entire mission, because like I mentioned earlier, sometimes the enemy that you link to will prematurely die, and if you don't catch that instantly, you're going to lose 15 of your stacks, because you will just instantly die the second an enemy decides to actually shoot you. There's also the annoyance of any time you run to loot, you lose your parasitic link. The fact that you're forced to be in one room pretty much the entire time because of your parasitic link and your 4. It's just kind of annoying to play around. However, he does so much damage, and red crits go burr, and also the fact that he can amplify other people's abilities does make him pretty fun. I think Nidus deserves a B+ for his fun rank. In conclusion, Nidus is an A tier Warframe who is very good in a pre-made group, who is pretty good by himself and is pretty bad in a squad with randoms.